Still remember that night, sitting by the flickering fire in the village kitchen. The air felt tense, thick, like something bad was waiting to happen. The elders had been talking for hours, worried about Amma, the new bride. They said there was something off about her, how she never learned to prepare even the simplest light soup, despite all the old women's teachings. In our village, a woman not knowing how to make light soup was unheard of. To us, it was more than just a skill. It was tradition, a way to honour family and ancestors. But every time Amma tried, the soup was wrong, too thin, too tasteless, sometimes sour. Her husband, Kojo, grew frustrated. People started whispering that she might be cursed or that she had married against her family's wishes. The elders said it was a sign, something dark was following her. One night, Kojo couldn't stand it anymore. He demanded that Amma make light soup perfectly, just once, or he would take her back to her family. Amma looked desperate. She went to the kitchen and we all waited, feeling the unease grow heavier. An hour later, she came back with the soup and it looked right, red, warm, with a rich aroma. Everyone praised her, but when Kojo took his first sip, his face turned pale. He dropped the bowl, gasping for air, and collapsed. Amma stood there watching, saying nothing, her eyes dark and unreadable. We rushed to help him, but it was too late. That night, the elders gathered again, and they decided to send Amma back to her family. They said that whatever was in her light soup had taken Kojo's spirit with it. I still remember that night. The air was tense in the small village kitchen, the fire flickering in the corner, casting long shadows on the walls. The elders, wrapped in their worn shawls, had been murmuring for hours, voices low and troubled. All their attention was on Amma, the new bride, and not in the way you'd expect. People were worried about her, whispering strange things behind her back. Amma was beautiful, with a graceful way about her, but there was one thing she could never seem to get right. She didn't know how to make light soup, the very meal that marked her place in her husband's family. For us, light soup wasn't just a dish. It was tradition, something every woman from a young age. The old women had tried to teach her again and again, but every time she failed. Her soups were always wrong. Thin like water, tasteless, sometimes sour. At first, people were patient. They thought maybe she'd get it in time. But as the weeks went on, her husband, Kojo, grew more and more frustrated. The whispers grew louder. Some said she was lazy. Others said maybe her family hadn't properly blessed the marriage, or that she had ignored some age-old ritual. The elders began to say that perhaps something dark followed her. Then, one night, Kojo had enough. He stood up in the middle of the village square, voice echoing in the quiet, and demanded that Amma make the soup properly, just once. "If you can't do it," he said, his voice cold, "then I will return you to your family. Maybe you're cursed, or maybe you don't care enough to honour this family." His words were sharp, cutting through the night air. Amma's face turned pale. She didn't say a word, just turned and walked quietly to the kitchen, the whole village watching her as she disappeared into the shadows. We waited, a strange silence settling over us, the kind that makes your skin crawl. In the kitchen, we could hear her moving around, the sound of water bubbling, pots clinking, the soft scrape of her wooden spoon. An hour passed, and then she returned, carrying a small bowl. Everyone leaned forward, drawn by the sight of it. The soup looked perfect, red and steaming, with the rich aroma of spices drifting through the air. It looked just like the light soup her husband's family was known for. Kojo gave her a skeptical look, but took the bowl from her hands. He looked at the soup for a moment, then brought it to his lips and took a careful sip. The moment the soup touched his tongue, something changed in his face. His eyes widened, his skin turned pale, and his lips parted in a silent gasp. His hands shook, and the bowl slipped from his grasp, crashing to the ground as he clutched his throat. Kojo gasped for air, stumbling backward, his body convulsing as he struggled to breathe. Amma stood there, motionless, watching as her husband collapsed to the ground. Her eyes were dark, empty, and she made no move to help him, as if this was what she had expected all along. The rest of us rushed to Kojo, frantically calling for help, trying to save him. But by the time we reached him, he was already gone. As Kojo lay still on the ground, everyone turned to Amma, horrified. Her face remained calm, her eyes unreadable. One of the elders stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You are cursed," he whispered, his voice filled with fear. "Whatever you brought into this family has taken your husband's spirit." The villagers backed away, some murmuring prayers under their breath, others making signs to ward off evil. The elders, who had once been kind to her, were now filled with suspicion and fear. They gathered again that night, this time without armor, and decided to send her back to her family the very next morning. They said that whatever darkness she had brought would follow her and that our village could not risk being touched by it. In the morning, they gave her nothing but a single cloth to cover herself and sent her off with only a few words and cold stares. As she walked away from the village, I remember feeling a chill run down my spine. She turned back just once, and her eyes met mine. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something there, something haunting and empty. Since then, the story of Amma has become a warning in our village, told to every young bride. We say that if you come into a marriage with secrets or bitterness, it will poison everything, just like it did with Amma's light soup. But in the back of my mind, I sometimes wonder if it was really her fault, or if there was something darker, something we'll never understand, hiding behind that last bowl of soup.